The most haunting sound on a cold Yorkshire morning in 1832 was not the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestones, but the quiet, rhythmic clinking of the iron halter as a man led his wife to the market square, a rope tied around her neck, her waist, or her arm, to sell her to the highest bidder, like a piece of common livestock. This was not a scene from a depraved novel or a singular act of madness. This was the accepted, and at times, celebrated practice of wife-selling in England, a tradition that flourished for over 200 years and saw hundreds, if not thousands, of women publicly auctioned off by their husbands. This is the story of a forgotten marketplace of human misery, a place where the bonds of matrimony were dissolved not by a judge's decree, but by the fall of an auctioneer's hammer. We will journey into the heart of a society so riddled with legal and social inequality that selling a human being was seen as a more practical solution than getting a divorce. We will stand in the crowd and watch as women, draped in ribbons to signify they were for sale, stood silently while their fates were decided for the price of a few shillings and a pint of gin. This is the shocking, untold history of the poor man's divorce court, a brutal and desperate custom that reveals a dark truth about the value of a woman in a world that considered her property. To understand how a nation that prided itself on Christian virtue and the rule of law could tolerate such a barbaric ritual, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, because the story of the women in halters is one that history has tried and failed to forget. To comprehend why a man would resort to the public humiliation of selling his wife, we must first understand the iron cage of English marital law. For the vast majority of the population in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, a legal divorce was not just difficult, it was a complete and utter fantasy. The Church of England, which held dominion over the institution of marriage, did not recognize divorce in the modern sense. It could grant a divorce from bed and board, a legal separation that allowed a couple to live apart but forbade them from ever remarrying. To obtain a full and absolute divorce, a divortium, a vinculo matrimoniae, with the right to remarry, was a Herculean task, an odyssey through a legal and financial labyrinth designed to be accessible only to the wealthiest and most powerful men in the kingdom. The process was astronomically expensive and deliberately convoluted. First, a man had to sue his wife's lover for damages in a common law court in a suit known as criminal conversation, a public and often scandalous trial that would lay bare the intimate details of the affair. If he won that suit, he then had to proceed to the ecclesiastical courts to obtain a legal separation. Only after succeeding in both of these costly legal battles could he begin the final step, petitioning Parliament itself for a private act of divorce. Each stage required armies of lawyers, witness testimony, and enormous fees. The total cost could run into the thousands of pounds, a sum equivalent to a fortune today, utterly beyond the reach of any laborer, farmer, or common tradesman. For a woman, the process was even more impossible. She could not sue for divorce on the grounds of adultery alone. She had to prove aggravated adultery, meaning her husband's infidelity had to be combined with life-threatening cruelty, incest, or bigamy, a standard of proof that was almost impossible to meet. For the working class, trapped in abusive, loveless, or broken marriages, there were essentially only two ways out: death or desertion. Wife-selling emerged from this legal void. It was a desperate, extra-legal, but socially recognized solution. It was folk law, a ritual created by the powerless to do what the powerful had made impossible. In the market square, amidst the shouting vendors and the stench of livestock, the poor man could find what the high courts of London denied him: a final and public end to a miserable marriage. The belief that a man could physically sell his wife stemmed from a legal doctrine so oppressive it is difficult for a modern mind to comprehend. The law of coverture. Derived from Norman French, coverture meant covered. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was completely submerged, or covered, by that of her husband. As the great English jurist William Blackstone famously wrote in 1765, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband." This was not a metaphor. It was a legal reality, with devastating practical consequences. A married woman, a femme covert, had no separate legal existence. She could not own property in her own name. Any land, money, or possessions she brought into the marriage immediately became her husband's absolute property. Every penny she earned, whether as a seamstress, a field hand, or a tavern worker, legally belonged to him. The very clothes on her back, the shoes on her feet, were his property. She could not sign a contract, incur debt, or sue, or be sued in a court of law. Her husband was legally entitled to her labor, her body, and her absolute obedience. He had the legal right to chastise her, a euphemism for physical discipline, as long as he did not cause permanent injury. If a wife ran away, her husband could sue her lover for damages for the loss of her services, in the same way he might sue a man for injuring his horse. This legal framework effectively reduced a married woman to the status of a dependent, a perpetual minor under the guardianship of her husband. It is from this dark soil of legal dehumanization that the logic of wife-selling grew. If a wife was, in the eyes of the law, a piece of property, a chattel, then it seemed to some to be a logical, if extreme, next step that she could be disposed of in the same manner as any other piece of property, by public auction. The halter that was placed around her neck was not just a theatrical prop, it was a horrifyingly accurate symbol of her legal status. It was the same rope used to lead a cow or a horse to market, a visual representation of her subjugation under the law of coverture. A wife sale was not a simple, furtive transaction. It was a public performance, a piece of social theater with its own established rituals and customs. The event almost always took place in a public space, typically the local market, outside a tavern, or at a crossroads, ensuring the maximum number of witnesses. The husband would often begin by paying the market toll, the same fee required to sell livestock, thus officially entering his property into the day's business. The central and most symbolic element was the halter. This was usually a rope, but could sometimes be a ribbon or a leather strap placed around the woman's neck, waist, or arm. This act was crucial. It visually transformed the woman from a person into a commodity, a piece of livestock being led to sale. The husband would then act as his own auctioneer, often climbing onto a stone block or a cart to address the assembled crowd. He would extol her virtues, much like a farmer selling a cow, announcing her age, her skills as a housekeeper or a worker, and sometimes, with grim humor, her flaws. The bidding would then commence. The prices varied wildly, from a few shillings to several pounds, but often the final price was nominal, a symbolic sum to legitimize the transaction. In many cases, the most valuable part of the sale was not the money, but a shared meal or a large quantity of beer at the local tavern, paid for by the buyer to treat the husband and the witnesses. In some instances, a formal bill of sale would be drawn up and signed by the husband, the buyer, and a witness, transferring the rights to the woman as if she were a piece of land. However, the most fascinating aspect of this theater was when the entire event was prearranged. In many cases, the wife had already begun a relationship with another man, and the sale was a collaborative performance by all three parties. The lover would agree in advance to be the buyer. The public auction was a way to legitimize their new relationship in the eyes of the community, to publicly sever the old marriage and sanctify the new one. In these cases, the wife was not a passive victim, but an active participant in a desperate drama, playing her part in the grim theater of public humiliation as her only path to a new life and a chance at happiness. The public nature of wife selling was essential to its function. The crowd was not just a collection of passive onlookers, it was an active participant, serving as both judge and witness. The community's presence transformed a private arrangement into a public binding act. By witnessing the sale, the entire town or village was acknowledging the dissolution of one marriage and the formation of a new union. This public consensus provided a form of social and moral legitimacy where legal legitimacy was impossible. The crowd's reaction could vary dramatically and often served as a form of communal justice. If the husband was known to be a drunkard, a brute, or was seen to be treating his wife with excessive cruelty during the sale, the crowd might turn on him. There are accounts of mobs jeering at the husband, pelting him with rotten vegetables, or forcibly rescuing the wife and driving him out of town. In one famous case, from 1822, a man named John Osborne sold his wife at a market, but the crowd, deeming his treatment of her to be cruel, seized him, put the halter around his own neck, and paraded him through the streets before throwing him into the river. Conversely, if the wife was known to have been unfaithful or was seen as a shrew, the crowd might cheer on the husband, validating his right to be rid of her. The price itself was often a subject of public commentary. A low price could be a source of deep humiliation for the husband, a public declaration that his property was of poor quality. A surprisingly high price might be met with cheers, a sign of the woman's perceived value or the buyer's great affection. This popular intervention demonstrates the unwritten rules of this lawless practice. While it was a brutal and dehumanizing ritual, it operated within a framework of community morality. The crowd acted as an informal court, passing judgment not on the legality of the act, but on its perceived fairness. The sale was a raw, public negotiation of social relationships, and the community's roar of approval or howl of outrage was the final, binding verdict. While it is impossible to look at the practice of wife selling as anything other than a product of a deeply misogynistic and oppressive system, it is crucial to recognize the nuances of the women's experiences. To paint every woman sold at market as a passive, weeping victim is to deny them the agency they so desperately fought to exercise. In a surprising number of documented cases, the wife was not just a willing participant in the sale, she was its primary architect. For a woman trapped in a miserable or violent marriage, with no legal recourse and no economic independence, a public sale could be the only viable escape route. Many women actively sought out a new partner, a man who could offer them a better life, and then collaborated with both their husband and their lover to arrange the sale. The public auction, in these instances, was a carefully staged event, a piece of theater designed to give their new life a stamp of social legitimacy. There are accounts of women dressing in their best clothes for their own sale, smiling and interacting with the crowd, and even protesting if the bidding didn't go their way or if their chosen buyer was being outbid. One woman in 1830, upon being sold for a mere 2 shillings and 6 pence, reportedly told her new owner, "I am yours, and you can do what you like with me," before turning to her old husband and cheekily telling him she was glad to be rid of him. This was not the statement of a crushed victim, but of a woman seizing a desperate opportunity. This is not to romanticize the practice. The fact that a woman's only path to freedom was through the profound humiliation of being sold like an animal is a damning indictment of the society she lived in. But within that oppressive framework, these women demonstrated incredible resilience and strategic thinking. They learned to work the system, however broken it was, to their own advantage. Their stories are a complex and often heartbreaking tapestry of coercion and consent, of oppression and quiet rebellion, a testament to the human will to survive and seek happiness even in the most impossible of circumstances. Every woman sold paid a terrible price in dignity, but for some, it was a price they were willing to pay for the chance at a life free from misery. The brutal logic of coverture, which rendered a wife the property of her husband, often extended to the most vulnerable members of the family, the children. In the cold calculus of a wife sale, children were frequently considered part of the package, their fates tied to that of their mother. Just as a farmer selling a cow might include her calf in the transaction, a man selling his wife often included their children, especially if they were young. Newspaper accounts and court records from the period are filled with chillingly casual references to this practice. A report from a 1815 sale in Smithfield Market notes that a man sold his wife, child, and all his household goods for a single lump sum. Another account describes a man selling his wife with her child in her arms. The children were treated as secondary assets, their value subsumed into that of their mother. This practice inflicted a profound and lasting trauma, a wound passed down through generations. For a child, witnessing their mother being led by a halter and sold in a public market would have been a deeply terrifying and confusing experience, shattering their sense of security and family. They were being sold away from their father, their home, and everything they had ever known, their lives completely upended by a crude commercial transaction. The psychological impact of being treated as an add-on to a larger sale, a piece of property tied to another piece of property, is difficult to fathom. This aspect of wife selling draws a chilling parallel to the practices of chattel slavery, where families were routinely torn apart on the auction block. In a society that prided itself on being free, the wife sale revealed a dark undercurrent where the principles of property and ownership could override the most basic human bonds of parent and child. It demonstrated that under the law of coverture, a father's authority was so absolute that he could, in the eyes of his community, legally and morally transfer not only his wife, but his own children, to another man for a handful of silver. The emotional echoes of this generational trauma, though unrecorded in official histories, undoubtedly lingered in the private histories of countless families for decades to come. While some women may have found a degree of freedom through the sale, Every transaction came with a hidden and heavy cost, the profound psychological trauma of public humiliation. No matter how willing a participant she was, the act of standing on a block with a rope around her neck, being inspected by a crowd of strangers, and having her worth debated in shillings and pence was a deeply degrading experience. The sale stripped her of her personhood in the most public way imaginable, reducing her to an object for male consumption. This trauma did not end when the hammer fell. The woman, now owned by a new man, had to live with the social stigma of having been the woman who was sold at market. She would be the subject of endless village gossip, her story told and retold in taverns and at sewing circles. Her new relationship, even if it was a loving one, began under the shadow of a commercial transaction. Was she a wife or a purchase? Her new partner's affection could always be questioned. Did he truly care for her, or did he simply get a good bargain? The risk of resale was also a constant source of anxiety. While most sales were intended to be permanent, there was no legal framework to prevent a new owner from selling her again if he grew tired of her or fell on hard times. There were documented cases of women being sold multiple times, passed from one man to another, like a piece of used furniture. The psychological scars of this precarious existence are hinted at in the sparse records of the time. Court records from other legal proceedings sometimes mention a woman's sale as a point of shame in her past. Local lore and folk songs often tell tragic tales of women who, unable to bear the shame and instability of their lives, fell into depression or took their own lives. For every story of a woman who found a better life, there were likely many more whose lives were simply a different kind of misery, their dignity traded for a brief moment of survival, their minds forever scarred by the memory of the halter and the auction block. The practice of wife-selling, which flourished in the chaos and social flux of the 18th and early 19th centuries, began its slow decline as Victorian society took shape. The forces that killed it were a complex mixture of legal reform, social pressure, and a profound shift in cultural morality. The rise of the evangelical movement and the emergence of a powerful, pious middle class brought a new emphasis on the sanctity of marriage and the ideal of the domestic family. To these reformers, wife-selling was not a pragmatic folk custom. It was a barbaric, sinful, and deeply embarrassing spectacle that stained the reputation of a modern Christian nation. Newspapers, which had once reported on the sales with a kind of amused detachment, began to condemn them in editorials, framing them as a symptom of lower-class ignorance and depravity. Magistrates and local authorities, who had often turned a blind eye to the practice, began to intervene, arresting husbands and buyers for public nuisance or disorderly conduct. Legal reforms, though slow, also began to chip away at the foundations of the practice. The most significant blow came with the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. This landmark piece of legislation moved divorce from the ecclesiastical courts and Parliament into a new secular court for divorce and matrimonial causes. While divorce was still expensive and difficult, it was, for the first time, a theoretical possibility for a wider segment of the population. The law also began to slowly recognize a wife's right to her own property and protection from abuse. Each new law, each court ruling, reinforced the idea that a wife was a person, not a possession, making the logic of selling her increasingly untenable. The practice did not die overnight. It retreated into the shadows, becoming a rarer and more clandestine affair. But its days as a public, socially sanctioned ritual were over. The rise of a new morality, combined with the slow, reluctant extension of legal rights to women, finally made the halter and the auction block a relic of a more brutal age. The halter, the simple length of rope or ribbon that defined the wife sale, is a powerful and deeply ambivalent symbol. On the one hand, it is the ultimate emblem of oppression, a direct link to the sale of livestock, a visual representation of a legal and social system that treated women as property. It is a symbol of profound dehumanization. Yet, in the hands of the women who actively participated in their own sales, it also became something else, a tool of desperate liberation. By submitting to the humiliation of the halter, they were able to break the iron bonds of an inescapable marriage. They took the most potent symbol of their subjugation and, through an act of incredible courage and strategic calculation, transformed it into an instrument of their own freedom. The halter, in this context, becomes a symbol of their resilience, their ability to find agency even within the most oppressive of systems. When we remember the wife sales today, It is crucial that we move beyond the simple shock value. These were not just bizarre historical anecdotes. They were the lived experiences of real women. Fictional portrayals, like the famous scene in Thomas Hardy's novel The Mayor of Casterbridge, are powerful. But they are grounded in dozens of documented, real-life cases found in court records, newspaper archives, and local histories. What this brutal practice ultimately reveals is the catastrophic failure of a system. When the law fails to provide justice, when the church fails to provide solace, and when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members, people will create their own desperate, flawed, and often brutal solutions. The story of the women in halters is a stark reminder that the true measure of a civilization is not found in its grand monuments or its powerful leaders, but in how it treats those who have no power at all.